This is the Panasonic LUMIX S1R II, and we're here at the Barbican in sunny London to see if the 6-year wait for the Panasonic S1R successor has been worth it. Let's go find out. So the Barbican is one of my favorite places to shoot, and the reason for that is, aside from its magnificent architecture, it's a must place to visit here in central London. But as you can probably see, one of the things that makes it really great for photography is the fact that you get these incredible shafts of light, and obviously that creates kind of hard shadow lines. So aside from the incredible architecture, it's a really great place to capture people. But obviously, because they are just shafts of light, you have to work really quickly. And that is one of the great things about the new S1R II, is that it has pre-capture. So that means that you can actually set the camera within a few parameters, I would say, up to about a second, where the camera will actually take a shot before you actually press a shutter, which is great if you need to work quickly and efficiently. So what is the Panasonic LUMIX S1R II? Well, to begin with, and to separate it from its predecessor, this is actually pitched as a hybrid camera, something that wasn't the case for the original iteration of this camera. At the time, if you might remember, we had the S1 and the S1H. So I think Panasonic probably wanted to keep those three models quite separate. This one's very much a hybrid camera, so it'll shoot video, so more on that later. In terms of stills, you're getting 44 megapixels from its full frame sensor. That's 3 under the original S1R. But I wouldn't focus on that. I really don't think that is an issue. 3 megapixels amounts to nothing. And I would actually welcome slightly bigger pixels for improved ISO performance. In terms of autofocus, you're getting 779 phase detect points, which is different from the 229, I believe, contrast detect points on the original S1R, and that's going to make a huge improvement in terms of autofocus performance, both for photo and for video. And these autofocus points go right to the edges. So if you're doing the movable AF points, it will literally go to every corner right to the edge, which I think is incredibly helpful and something that not everyone actually does. ISO performance goes from 80 all the way to 51,200. So again, that's pretty standard as well. One of my favorite things about the original S1R was the OLED viewfinder. At the time, in 2019, I couldn't really believe my eyes when I first used the OLED viewfinder. It was just so lovely and sharp and organic and rich. And I realized at the time that it was leaps and bounds ahead of anyone. And what's unusual is that Panasonic have actually kept the resolution exactly the same on the S1R II. And I don't see that as a problem. I think for me, monitoring is just that. It is monitoring. It's making sure that your color, your dynamic range is good, and that you can almost expose the image based on what you're seeing. And this camera does exactly that. I think 5.76 million dots is the absolute sweet spot. And I think it's a spec that I think will be fine even 5 years from now. I could not want any more out of it. Aside from that, you still get a 3-inch rear LCD panel. The resolutions drop slightly from, I think, 2,000 dots to 1.84 thousand dots. I'm not sure why that is, but again, I don't see it as a problem at all. I still have a lovely, bright, and very, very clear monitor at the back as well. Aside from the OLED viewfinder, you also have the 3-inch display at the back, which is absolutely fantastic. It is a touchscreen display, and it's incredibly responsive, very, very bright, and very clear. It does have a slight drop in resolution from the S1R Mark I. So this one is actually 1.84K dots of resolution versus 2.1 on the original S1R. I don't think that's a problem at all. Again, much like with the OLED viewfinder, it is there for monitoring. This is not how you're going to be displaying your images. So I think so long as it is clear, bright, and has good dynamic range so you can expose off the back of it, I think that's absolutely fine. So one of the things to mention about the camera, which I touched upon before, is the fact that this actually has a really, really advanced autofocus system, something that the original S1R kind of didn't. So this one obviously has 779 face detect AF points across the entire frame. But it also has quite an advanced subject detect. So it has people, it has eyes, it has animals, it has animal eyes, body, planes, trains, and automobiles. You name it, it has it. And I think for me, a really, really good test as to how good something is to take a dynamic subject like a bird. I mean, obviously this one here isn't flying away and flying across the frame. But what's amazing about the camera is it doesn't matter if I have it half pressed and I bring it up to where the bird roughly is, it immediately locks onto it. Even if I come out of frame like this, so long as I'm half pressed, it's always tracking the subject. And it just didn't miss. It's really, really quite impressive how good the camera is at actually tracking a subject like a bird. So when I was doing the autofocus test with the ducks earlier, I actually realized that I'd set the camera to burst mode. So it's quite an important spec to actually mention on this camera, which is actually pretty incredible. So the original S1R had a max burst rate of about 6 frames a second, which is pretty normal back then, and I think it was pretty good considering the resolution of the camera. This one actually gives you a 40-shot burst rate, which is absolutely incredible. And it's also important to mention that it's blackout free. So whenever you're shooting, you're just seeing the frames happen, but nothing is kind of blacking out, so you still see the motion of whatever subject you're actually capturing, which is incredibly important. If it's something that's moving across the frame, it can be incredibly distracting when you're shooting at that speed and you keep getting blacking out. This camera won't do that, which is great. So as mentioned before, the Panasonic LUMIX S1R II is pitched as a hybrid camera. So it does video as well as stills, but the video side is also very, very good rather than just being an afterthought. So let's start with the specs on this. So it'll shoot 8K and it's 8K open gate. So that means that it uses actually the full size of the sensor. So in terms of shooting 8K, it'll do 8K in 24, 25 and 30p. So in terms of 4K, which is what the majority of people will be shooting in, it'll do 24, 25, 30p and 120p 10-bit internal, which is hugely impressive. The camera will also shoot 5.8K ProRes internal for those of you who wish to use that file format. So the Panasonic S1R II, much like the GH7, will do 32-bit flow audio, which is amazing. Now you will need the XLR2 module that sits on top of the camera here, but it means that you can access that really amazing technology borrowed from the GH7. Basically, for those of you out there who don't know what 32-bit flow audio is, most good audio is about 24-bit, but it does mean that you have to be a bit more careful with your audio setup. With 32-bit flow, it basically means that you don't really have to worry about your audio clipping and distorting. So let's talk a little bit about the handling of the camera. Now, from a spec point of view, this camera is a lot lighter than its predecessor. The original S1R actually weighed just over 1 kilogram. This one comes in at 795 grams. I find that to be a pretty decent weight saving, which I think will be welcome to any photographer or videographer out there. In terms of size, it's actually a lot smaller than the S1R as well. I remember the S1R, and even though it felt very, very solid in the hand, it did feel like quite a brick in your hand. This one actually just feels a lot more svelte and a lot more manageable, should I say, but it still retains that really incredible grip. So it always feels very, very safe in your hand. So obviously I'm running a strap today, but even if I wasn't, I would feel very, very safe with this in my hand without a strap. So in terms of the rear screen, as I've mentioned before, it's a 3-inch LCD. What I didn't mention is the fact that it's fully articulating, and it's absolutely awesome. So not only does it articulate outwards like that and pivots, it also comes out like this. So it's basically a vari-angle screen in the back, which makes it incredible for pretty much any kind of shooting or any angle. So if you do mount it on a gimbal, for example, you don't ever have to worry about monitoring, because you can pretty much turn the screen however you like, which is great for people that shoot in a variety of different ways. In terms of buttons and controls, the camera is incredibly well laid out. So I normally like a dedicated ISO dial, but this one does the next best thing, which is an ISO button, which you trigger by pressing on it, and then you can actually change the value with this kind of multi-control dial that sits on the top here. Other than that, this being a hybrid camera, it has various record buttons. So it does have the top record button here, which is red. It also has the one here, which is great for content creators who need to obviously have easy access to controls. The rest of it is very similar to the previous camera, but everything is just a little bit kind of tighter packed, because obviously the camera has a smaller form factor. It has obviously the two main dials here. Here's to kind of control your type of shooting. So for example, if you want to expose manually, or if you want to use the semi-automatic functions as well. And then you have the kind of C1, C2, all the way to C5 programmable modes as well, depending on the type of shooting that you're doing as well. So in terms of recording media, the camera will record to SD cards, but also CF Express as well. So you do have an option there depending on what kind of media you already have. So let's talk a little bit about IBIS, or in-body image stabilization. Well, the S1R Mark II is quoted as having a whopping 8 stops of IBIS versus the 6 stops on the original S1R. When I hear 8 stops, I'm always a little bit doubtful whether I'll get a full 8 stops. But I'm actually pleased to say that stood here on this really dynamic scene, I managed to get pretty much 8 stops. So like I always say in my reviews, whenever I calculate IBIS, I do the 1-for-1 rule in terms of focal length versus shutter speed. So in this case, I was shooting at about 28mm. So let's call that 30mm. So I basically match my focal length to my shutter speed. So 30mm, 1/30th, and then I work my way down from that. So from 1/30th, I work out that 8 stops is about 4 seconds, which is pretty insane. And I actually managed to get a full 4 seconds. I wouldn't say that I would get it every single time, but I would say that about half the time, easily half the time, I would get it 4 seconds. Once you start getting to 3 seconds, 2 seconds, and 1 second, you pretty much get it every time. So really, really impressive IBIS performance from this camera. So we just concluded a really quick ISO test, and we chose this scene here as, obviously it's still daylight outside, but this is the kind of scene that you would normally use high ISO for. So obviously you do have a lot of kind of shadows that can get blocked up very easily, but obviously you do have some bright highlighted spots in these ceiling lights that you see here. So I did actually use pretty much all the ISO values, but we're going to talk mainly about the higher ISO values. So we shot all the way to 51,200. But what I actually found is that in terms of believability, in terms of what you're going to shoot, you're probably going to be using 1600 all the way to about 6400 or so. And I actually found that the camera was actually incredibly capable, even at 6400 or even 12,800. At that point, it does begin to break up a little bit, but that's pretty much in line with every camera that's out in the market at the moment. So actually, I'm incredibly impressed by the ISO performance of this camera. So that pretty much concludes our day with the S1R Mark II. So all that's left to say really is, what do I like about it and who is it for? So we'll do things in order. The first thing that I really liked about it is the form factor. I love the fact that it's a lot smaller and a lot lighter than the original S1R. I think Panasonic have done a great job of keeping this camera very, very small and just very intelligently designed in terms of layout and just the way it feels in hand. But I love the fact that it's maintained a lot of the things of what made the original S1R great. Monitoring is fantastic, the vari-angle screen is great, but you also retain that kind of high megapixel sensor. It's not too high, it's not too low, it just hits that sweet spot of round about 45, in this case 44 megapixels, which I think is great. But I think what makes this camera truly special is the fact that it is a true hybrid camera. It's rare that you see a camera that has such impressive stills, as well as video specs. And this one truly is it. With 8K open gates and 32-bit float, but also that incredibly high resolution count for stills, I think Lumix have made their intentions very, very clear with this camera, and I think that's what makes it really, really special. I really enjoy shooting with this camera today, and I hope you will too. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.